The words hit Susan Brenner like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, stopping the air in her lungs before she even had a chance to draw the next breath. "I have watched you work alone every season," Jonas Turner said, his voice low and rough as gravel dragged across dry earth, "and I am done watching." She stood at the fence line with a mending hammer loose in her fingers and a strand of barbed wire she had already fixed twice this month. And she looked at this man, this weathered, sun-darkened, broad-shouldered cattleman who had been her neighbor for 3 years, without ever once crossing onto her side of the property. And she felt something shift inside her chest like tectonic plates that had been grinding quietly for a very long time, finally giving way to the inevitable. She did not say anything for a moment. She could not. Because the truth was, she had known this was coming, had felt it building the way a rancher feels a storm before the clouds even roll, in something in the air, something in the pressure, something in the way Jonas Turner had been watching her from across the fence with those dark, careful eyes that never seemed to miss a single thing she did. The problem was not that he was offering to help her. The problem was that Susan Brenner did not know how to let anyone help her, not after everything she had survived to get here, not after everything she had lost, and not after the secrets she was still carrying in the quietest corners of herself like stones sewn into a coat. She tightened her grip on the hammer. "I do not need anyone watching me," she said. And Jonas Turner, who had spent 34 years learning when to push and when to wait, looked at her with those steady eyes and said, "Maybe not, but I am telling you anyway." It had not started here at this fence line in the autumn of 1887 in the high grassland of eastern Montana. It had started 2 years earlier and half a continent away, in a Cincinnati courtroom, where Susan Brenner had signed her name to a set of documents that took away everything she thought she had and gave her the only thing she had ever really wanted: the freedom to leave. She had been 26 years old when she arrived in the town of Dalton Creek, Montana Territory, with a single trunk, $212 hidden in the lining of her coat, a land deed that her father had signed over to her before his death, and a kind of determination so fierce and so brittle that the stagecoach driver had taken one look at her face and not said a word for the entire last 8 miles. The land her father had left her was 160 acres of deeded homestead ground east of Dalton Creek, bordered on the north by a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains, on the south by open range that was technically federal land, on the east by a road that nobody used anymore, and on the west by the property line of the Turner Cattle Company, which was the single largest private landholding in that part of the territory. She had known about the Turner Cattle Company from the deed paperwork. She had not known about Jonas Turner himself until the morning after she arrived, when she had walked out onto the porch of the small, neglected cabin that sat at the center of her land and looked west and saw, at the fence line a quarter-mile away, a tall man on a dark horse watching her. He had not waved. She had not waved. He had turned his horse and ridden away along the fence line, and she had gone back inside and started making a list of everything the cabin needed, and she had told herself, firmly and without any room for debate, that she was not here to make friends with cattlemen. She was here to survive. She was here to build something. She was here because she had run out of everywhere else to go, and this dry, wind-swept, enormously beautiful piece of ground was the only thing in the world that was entirely hers. The backstory of Susan Brenner was not a simple one, and it was not a story she told freely, because the territory of eastern Montana was full of people who had come west specifically to leave their histories behind them, and that was a custom that she respected, and that she relied upon herself. But the bones of it were these. She had been born in Cincinnati, Ohio, the only daughter of a cattle broker named Thomas Brenner, who had done well enough in his trade to leave her the Montana land he had taken as partial payment for a debt that had never otherwise been settled. Her mother had died when Susan was 12, and she had grown up helping run her father's business accounts, which meant she understood ledgers and contracts, and the particular way that men talked around women when they thought the women were not paying close attention. She had married at 23. His name was Richard Colton, and he had been charming and well-dressed, and had spoken to her like she was intelligent, which in 1884 Cincinnati was not as common as it should have been. She had thought she loved him. She had discovered within the first year of their marriage that Richard Colton had a talent for spending money that did not belong to him and a gift for making sure that other people bore the consequences of his debts. By the time she left him, he had run through her inheritance, her savings, and a significant portion of her dignity, and she had spent 18 months in a legal battle that drained the last of her resources but gave her back her freedom and the single remaining asset that Richard had not managed to reach. The Montana deed that her father had never transferred to her husband's name because Thomas Brenner had not trusted Richard Colton from the moment he shook the man's hand. She was grateful to her father for that every single day. She had arrived in Dalton Creek in the spring of 1885 with those $212, that deed, and a silence around her like armor. She had introduced herself to exactly as many people as necessary, hired a local man named Carl Prentice to spend 2 weeks helping her repair the cabin roof and the most critical fence sections, and then she had set about learning how to run a ranch alone. She had made every mistake that a person can make in the first year of ranching. She had bought the wrong kind of seed for her kitchen garden. She had misjudged how long the hay would need to last through the winter and had run short by 3 weeks in February. She had let a section of the north fence go unreinforced for too long and lost 2 of her 4 cattle through it. She had caught a fever in October that had laid her flat for 10 days and had had to accept a supply drop from the trading post on credit. But she had learned. She had learned fast, because the alternative to learning fast was losing the land, and losing the land was a thing she was not going to allow herself to do. By the end of her second season, she had 8 cattle, a repaired root cellar, a kitchen garden that had actually produced enough to put up for winter, and a reputation in Dalton Creek as a woman who was quiet, capable, and not interested in charity. She had also, by the end of that second season, developed a thorough and somewhat infuriating awareness of Jonas Turner. He had not spoken to her, not directly, not for the first full year, but he had been present in the particular way that a large and steady thing is present, the way a mountain is present, or a river, something that shapes the landscape around it without making any particular noise about doing so. She had seen him at the fence line a dozen times, always at a distance, always on horseback, always watching. She had seen him in town twice, had nodded at him from across the street, and he had returned the nod with a gravity that suggested he was taking the acknowledgement seriously. She had learned things about him the way you learn about a neighbor in a small territory, in fragments and second-hand accounts, pieced together over time. Jonas Turner was 32 years old. He had been born in Texas and had driven cattle north at 17, had worked for 3 different outfits before saving enough to buy the first section of what was now a 4,000-acre ranch. He had built the Turner Cattle Company over 14 years through a combination of hard work, careful management, and an apparently uncanny ability to read both cattle and weather. He had a reputation as a fair man, a demanding employer, and someone who paid his debts on time. He was not married. He had never been married, as far as anyone in Dalton Creek knew. He employed 6 full-time ranch hands and hired seasonal labor for branding and roundup. He kept largely to himself outside of what business required. He had, according to the postmaster's wife, a temper that he kept on a very tight rein, and eyes that most women in the territory found unsettling for reasons they could not quite articulate. Susan Brenner found them unsettling for a reason she could articulate perfectly well, which was that they saw too much. Every time she was in proximity to Jonas Turner, she had the particular uncomfortable feeling of being read accurately, which was something that she had trained herself to resist in other people with considerable success, and which he apparently did without any effort at all. The first time he had actually spoken to her had been in the summer of her second year, the summer of 1886. She had been trying to move her small cattle herd from one section of her land to another, and one of the steers, a big, stupid, ornery animal she had privately named Trouble, had gotten through a weak section of the western fence and onto Turner land. She had gone to the fence line with a rope and her best expression of calm authority, and she had found the steer already being moved back toward her property by one of Turner's ranch hands, a young man named Pete, who was managing the job competently but not without some difficulty. Jonas Turner had been sitting on his horse 20 yards behind Pete, watching. When Pete got the steer back through the gap and Susan had thanked him, Turner had ridden forward. He had stopped on his side of the fence and looked at the gap and then looked at her. "That fence section needs a new post," he said. It was not an accusation. It was simply a statement of fact. "I know," she said. "If you need lumber," he said, "I have extra cut from the windbreak project I finished last month." She had looked at him for a moment. There was no trap in his face. There was no hidden motive she could identify. There was just the offer, plain and direct. "I have my own lumber," she said, "but thank you." He had nodded, turned his horse, and ridden away, and she had fixed the fence section herself that same afternoon. That had been the longest conversation they had had for the next 6 months. But something had changed after that exchange, something small and structural. He had stopped watching from a distance and started occasionally acknowledging her from the fence line with a word or two when their work brought them near each other at the property boundary. She had started doing the same. It was not friendship. It was not anything she had a good name for. It was more like the careful establishment of a perimeter between two people who both understood that a perimeter, in this case, was probably a necessary defense. She had known why she needed the defense. She was 35% sure that she knew why he did. The winter of 1886 into 1887 had been what the territory called a hard winter, which in eastern Montana meant temperatures that dropped to 40 below on the worst nights, snowfall that buried fence lines, and a sustained brutal cold that tested every animal and every structure on every property in the region. She had lost one cow. She had nearly lost another to a wound that got infected in the cold, and had spent 3 nights in the barn with the animal, keeping the wound cleaned and the cow alive through what turned out to be sheer determination and a level of stubbornness that she privately acknowledged was excessive. She had come through the winter thinner and tireder and more competent than she had gone into it. In the spring she had expanded her herd, buying 3 more cattle from a rancher who was selling out to move back east. She had planted more of her north field than she had the previous year. She had repaired every fence section that the winter had damaged and added a second section of fencing along the creek bank to keep her cattle from straying into the water. It was on one of these fence repair projects, in the warm early weeks of September 1887, that she had been working alone at the western fence line when she heard hoofbeats and looked up and found Jonas Turner dismounting from his horse on his side of the fence with the particular purposeful manner of a man who has made a decision. She had thought he was coming to tell her about a problem, a cattle incursion, a fence gap, something practical. That was what they talked about when they talked. Practical things at careful distances. He had walked to the fence line and stopped, and he had looked at her with those dark, reading eyes, and he had said, "I have watched you work alone every season, and I am done watching." The air between them had gone very still after she said she did not need anyone watching her. She could feel her own heartbeat in a way that was slightly alarming, a quick, uneven pressure behind her ribs that she recognized as something she had been working very hard not to feel for a long time. Jonas Turner looked at the hammer in her hand, and then looked at the section of fence she had been working on and said, "You have 3 posts that need replacing in this section. I can see it from my side." "I know," she said again, which was the same thing she had said to him about the fence post a year ago, and the memory of that exchange hit her with an unexpected warmth. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the ghost of one, held back by the same reserve that seemed to govern everything about him. "I have extra posts," he said. "Cut and ready. I will bring them over tomorrow morning." She opened her mouth to say she had her own posts, which was a lie, and something in her throat stopped the words. Because she was standing here in the September heat with grass seeds in her hair and her hands raw from wire work, and the honest truth was that she had used her last replacement posts on the north fence line in August, and she had not yet gotten into town to order more. She looked at him. She looked at the fence. She looked back at him. "All right," she said. And Jonas Turner nodded, and there was something in his face that was not triumph but was something adjacent to relief, and he said, "I will be here at first light." He was there at first light. He came with a wagon loaded with 6 fence posts and the right tools and no conversation beyond the work itself, and they spent 4 hours repairing that section of fence together. And he did not talk too much, and did not try to take over, and did not make her feel like she needed to justify herself or explain herself or perform gratitude beyond a simple thank you when they finished. He packed his tools back into the wagon. He stood by his horse and looked at the repaired fence line and then at her. "I can come back Thursday," he said. "There is a section on your east boundary that looks like it needs work." She raised her eyebrows. "You have been looking at my east boundary." "I can see it from the road," he said, which was technically not a lie but was also clearly not the whole truth, and they both knew it, and a very peculiar feeling moved through her, something that was partly irritation and partly something much warmer and far more dangerous. "Thursday," she said. He came Thursday. He came again the following Monday. He came twice in October. Each time it was framed as a practical thing, fence work or drainage or something structural, and each time they worked alongside each other in a silence that was gradually, careful increment by careful increment, becoming less guarded and more comfortable. She began to notice things about him. The way he moved with an economy that spoke of someone who had been doing physical work his entire life, and had learned to expend exactly the effort required and no more. The way he watched his own cattle from a distance with the same attention he gave to everything, not anxious, not distracted, but present in a way that most people were not. The way he occasionally said something that was funny without making any visible effort to be funny. A dry, quiet observation delivered so straight-faced that she had laughed twice before realizing he had meant to make her laugh. She noticed the scar along his left forearm, a long pale line that spoke of something serious. She noticed that he wore his hat at a particular angle when he was thinking hard about something. She noticed that his voice, which was generally very controlled, went a shade warmer when he talked about his cattle or about the land, and she understood that feeling precisely because it was the same thing that happened to her own voice when she talked about her property. She also noticed that he was careful not to ask her about her past, which she was grateful for, and which also, paradoxically, made her more inclined to eventually tell him. In November, one of her cattle got badly injured in a fall near the creek bank, a deep gash on the animal's flank from a hidden root system exposed by the recent rain. She managed to get the animal back to the barn, but the wound needed stitching that was beyond what she had supplies for. She rode to Jonas Turner's ranch at dusk, which was the first time she had ever crossed onto his property, and she knocked on the door of the ranch house, and he opened it still wearing his work clothes and took one look at her face and said, "What do you need?" she told him. He had the supplies. He rode back with her in the gathering dark without any commentary about the hour or the inconvenience, and they stitched the animal together in her barn by lantern light. And when they were done, he washed his hands in the bucket, and she made coffee on the small iron stove, and they sat at her table for the first time and drank it, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that means something. "How long have you been doing this alone?" he asked, and it was the first time he had asked her anything that went beyond the immediate practical. She thought about the question. "Since I got here," she said, "which is about 2.5 years. Before that." He asked, and his voice had that careful quality, the quality of someone who is offering a door but not pushing her through it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The lantern light made the kitchen feel small and warm and separate from the cold Montana night outside. "Before that, I was married to someone who made decisions for me," she said. "I decided I preferred my own decisions." He looked at her across the table and nodded once, and she had the feeling that he had suspected as much and that he was not going to ask for more than she was offering. "That tracks," he said. She looked at him. "Does it? You work like someone who has something to prove," he said. "But not to anyone here, to yourself." The accuracy of that landed somewhere in the center of her chest and sat there warm and slightly uncomfortable, like a coal that has been banked against the cold. "What about you?" she said, because fairness required it and because she found that she actually wanted to know. "You built all of this alone." "Not entirely alone," he said, "but mostly." "Why mostly?" He looked at his coffee for a moment. "I came north with nothing and I built something from nothing," he said. "And when you do that, you get careful about what you let close, because you know how easily it can be taken." She understood that. She understood that in her bones. "Dark past," she said, and she meant it lightly as a kind of test of the air between them. He looked up at her with a spark in those dark eyes that was the closest she had seen him come to being caught off guard. Then he almost smiled. "Something like that," he said. She did not push. He did not push. They finished their coffee, and he rode home in the dark, and she sat at her table for a long time afterward with her hands around the empty cup and admitted to herself, quietly and without fanfare, that she was in serious trouble. The trouble deepened through November and into the early weeks of December. He continued coming over, and the pretexts became gradually less focused on practical work and more openly social. He brought a piece of equipment that he said she could borrow, which she had not asked for but which turned out to be genuinely useful. She brought a jar of preserved plums to his ranch house when she was in the neighborhood, which she had not needed to do but which felt right in the way that honest things feel right. His ranch hands noticed. She knew they noticed because Pete, the young hand who had helped with her steer, grinned at her in an extremely transparent way every time she came near the property. She chose to find this endearing rather than irritating, mostly because it was too late to find it irritating. She had dinner at his ranch house for the first time in mid-December. He cooked a beef stew with the methodical competence of someone who has been cooking for himself for a long time, and it was good. And they sat at his table in the big warm kitchen of the ranch house and talked for 3 hours. And she learned things about him that made the picture she had been building from fragments suddenly resolve into something clear and detailed and unexpectedly moving. He had grown up poor in Texas. His father had been a difficult man, not violent, he said, but absent in the way that mattered more, present in body and absent in attention, in warmth, in the kind of seeing that children need. His mother had died when he was 14. He had left at 17 with a horse and a bedroll and $40 and had driven cattle north because north was the direction of work and work was the direction of not starving. He had been, he said with the same flat directness with which he said everything, lonely for most of his adult life. Not unhappy, he was careful to make the distinction, but lonely in the particular way of someone who has built a self-sufficient life and is excellent at it, and who is occasionally aware, in the quiet hours, that self-sufficiency was not the same thing as what he actually wanted. She sat across from him and felt the forbidden quality of this conversation, the dangerous intimacy of it, the way it was pulling at something she had sworn to herself she would keep safely behind walls, and she let it pull anyway because she was tired of the walls. "What did you actually want?" she asked. He looked at her for a long, steady moment in the lamplight of his kitchen, and he said, "I think you know." She did know. That was the problem and the answer and the thing that changed everything. She rode home in the cold December dark with her heart beating too fast and her mind working through implications, and she told herself that she was a practical woman who had been hurt before, and that she needed to think this through carefully before she did anything irreversible. She thought it through for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, she rode back to his ranch, in the middle of the afternoon, not because she needed to borrow anything or return anything or consult about any fence, but simply because she wanted to see him, and she had decided that the simplest honest thing was to go see him. He was in the corral working with a young horse when she rode up, a process that required his complete attention, and she tied her horse to the fence and sat on the top rail and watched him work. And there was something in watching him move with the horse patient and confident and completely present. That bypassed every remaining defense she had constructed and went directly to the center of her. When the horse was settled and he walked over to where she was sitting on the fence rail, he looked up at her with those dark reading eyes and said nothing, and she said, "I keep thinking about what you said." "Which part?" he said. "All of it," she said. He rested his forearms on the fence rail and looked up at her, and the winter light was thin and clear, and the cold had put color in both their faces, and he said, "Susan." It was only her name. He had barely used it before, but the way he said it, with all the careful control he usually kept in place stripped away, made her feel seen in a way that she had not felt seen in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Do not make it complicated," he said. "I am not asking you to give anything up. I am not asking you to be anything you are not. I am just asking if I can be here." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about betrayal, the specific, corrosive kind she had experienced before, the kind that comes from trusting the wrong person. She thought about the walls she had built. She thought about the fence line between their properties and the particular charge that had always existed at that boundary, invisible and undeniable. She said, "You can be here." The weeks that followed were the most careful and deliberate courtship she had ever experienced, and it was also, paradoxically, the most natural one. They had already built the scaffolding, the 2 years of proximity, the shared work, the conversations that had gradually opened, and what grew on that scaffolding now was something that felt less like a beginning and more like an arrival. He came every day. Not always for long, not always with specific purpose, but he came. Sometimes they worked together on her land or his. Sometimes they simply sat on her porch in the cold December evenings with coffee and talked. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, which she had always valued in other people. And so the conversations they had were real ones, with actual substance and real stakes. She told him about Richard Colton in pieces over several evenings. Not everything at once. She was not built for that kind of wholesale disclosure, but enough, incrementally, that he understood what had been taken from her and why she had come west, and why she worked with the particular driven intensity that she did. He listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering premature reassurance, without the specific kind of male performance of comfort that she had learned to distrust, because it usually meant the listener was more focused on being seen to comfort than on actually hearing what was said. He just listened, and when she finished he said he was a fool, with a quiet finality that was more comforting than any elaborate expression of sympathy would have been. "He was," she said, "but so was I for not seeing it sooner." "You were 23 and you trusted someone the way people trust at 23, he said. "That is not foolish, that is just young." She looked at him across her kitchen table in the lamplight. "Were you ever that young?" she asked. "Once," he said, with a shadow crossing his face that she filed away to ask about later. It did not work out either. She did not push that night. But she came back to it a few weeks later when they were walking along the creek in the cold, clear morning of late December, the water running low and dark between its ice-edged banks. "Tell me about once," she said. He was quiet for a moment, walking with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the water. Then he told her. Her name had been Clara. He had been 24 and she had been 22, and they had met in a cattle town in Wyoming, and he had believed, with the complete conviction of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious, that he had found the person he was going to build his life with. She had left. Not for another man. He was careful to say that because he wanted to be honest, and the truth was not shameful but simply painful. She had left because the life he was building was too hard and too uncertain and too remote, and she had wanted something that the frontier could not offer her, and he had loved her enough to let her go without making her feel guilty about it. But it had taught him something, and the lesson had been: do not ask someone to share a life that they have not chosen. Do not ask. Wait until you find someone who is already here, who has already chosen this, who is already standing on the ground you stand on. He looked at Susan as he said this last part, standing on the ice-edged bank of the creek in the December cold, and she understood that he had been saying it about her for a long time. She reached out and took his hand. He went very still for a moment, the way an animal goes still when it is startled and is not yet sure whether to bolt or to hold, and then he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood by the creek, and the cold was sharp, and the sky above the Montana hills was the bright hard blue of deep winter, and she thought, here. This is what here feels like. They were not young people in the reckless way of 20-year-olds, and so the courtship moved with the particular deliberateness of people who know what they want and are choosing it with full knowledge of the cost. But it was not slow in the sense of tentative or uncertain. It was slow in the sense of savored, the way a person savors something that they have been patient for, and that turns out to be exactly worth the patience. January came in with a cold snap that dropped temperatures to brutal levels and kept them both close to their own properties for nearly 2 weeks, tending livestock and fighting frozen water lines, and doing all the relentless physical work that a Montana winter required. But they were not isolated from each other. He sent Pete over with firewood twice when the supply on her land ran short, and she sent back a letter with Pete that she had written at her kitchen table at midnight, which was the first letter she had written to anyone in 2 years, and which said, in her direct practical way, that she was thinking about him, and that the cold was annoying, and that she expected him to come for supper the first day the weather broke. He came for supper the first day the weather broke. He brought a bottle of good whiskey from a supply he apparently reserved for occasions that warranted it, and he stood in her kitchen in the lamplight with snow still on his coat, and looked at her the way he had looked at her on the fence line in September, with that quality of finished patience that meant he had made up his mind completely, and she said, "You look like a man who has something to say." "I do," he said. "I have been thinking it for a while, and I want to say it properly." She put down the dish she was holding. "All right," she said. He did not seem nervous, which she respected. He seemed the way he always seemed, entirely himself, entirely present, not performing anything. "I want to marry you, Susan," he said. "I want to build something together. I have spent a long time watching you build something alone, and I admire everything you have made, and I am not asking to take any of it from you. I am asking if we can add to it, together." She had known it was coming. She had known for weeks. And yet the reality of him standing in her kitchen saying those words in that particular voice with that particular steadiness landed with a force that surprised her, because the knowing and the actual moment were completely different things, and the actual moment had a weight to it that the knowing had not prepared her for. She was silent for long enough that something flickered in his eyes, just a moment of vulnerability, quick and then controlled, and she said, "Jonas." "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. He went still. "Yes, you are saying my name, or yes. Yes, I will marry you," she said, and she was laughing, which was not how she had expected to respond to a marriage proposal, but which felt completely right. And he laughed too, which was a sound she had heard rarely, and which she realized she intended to hear a great deal more of. And the bottle of whiskey was opened, and the supper was eaten, and they sat at her kitchen table until very late and talked about what they were going to build. The practical questions were not simple. They had 2 separate properties, 2 separate operations, nearly 6,000 acres of land between them, and a combined set of assets and liabilities that required careful thinking. They were both serious people who had built what they had through careful thinking, and so they spent several evenings working through the practical realities before any public announcement was made. Susan's land was hers. That was the first and non-negotiable point, and Jonas did not question it for a single moment. "It was yours before I entered the picture," he said, "and it will be yours after. We combine the operations as partners with equal say, but the deed stays in your name." She looked at him. "Most men would not say that. Most men have not watched you work for 3 years," he said. "I know exactly what you built, and I know exactly how you built it. It would be stupid as well as wrong to treat it as anything other than yours." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You are a good man, Jonas Turner." "I try to be," he said, simply and without false modesty. They married in March of 1888 in the Dalton Creek Church, a small building that smelled of pine and cold stone and had windows that looked out over the hills toward the mountains. The minister was a man named Reverend Hale, who had been in the territory for 12 years and who conducted the ceremony with a brevity and warmth that suited both of them perfectly. She wore her best dress, which was a deep navy wool that she had bought in Cincinnati 3 years ago for a purpose she could no longer remember, and it turned out to be exactly right for a wedding in a Montana church in March, which was still cold and would be cold for another 2 months. She had pinned a piece of green ribbon at her collar, which had been her mother's ribbon, the one piece of sentiment she allowed herself. Jonas wore a dark coat she had not seen before and had apparently acquired specifically for the occasion, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that she was going to remember for the rest of her life. Not the controlled, carefully held expression she had come to know well, but something completely open and unhidden, something that said, without any ambiguity, "Here. This is exactly where I wanted to be." Pete and 2 of the other ranch hands attended, which was touching. The postmaster's wife and 2 women from town attended, which was the extent of Susan's social connections in Dalton Creek, and which felt sufficient. The trading post owner, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had extended her credit in her first winter, and whose ongoing goodwill she valued, attended and congratulated them both with genuine warmth. They had supper at Jonas's ranch house afterward, which was larger and better appointed for hosting than her cabin, and it was a simple, good evening, and when everyone had gone home and they were alone for the first time as married people, she stood in the kitchen of his ranch house and felt the peculiar and profound significance of the ordinary moment. The lamps burning, the fire in the stove, the winter outside, the man beside her. "This is strange," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Strange how?" "Not bad strange," she said. "Strange in the way that something you chose and worked for and wanted very much is strange when it actually arrives, because you spent so long imagining it that the real thing is different from the imagining, and the difference is that the real thing is better." He put his arm around her and she felt the warmth of him, solid and real and chosen, and she leaned into it and let the strangeness become familiar, which took about 30 seconds. The spring of 1888 was the first season she had not worked alone. It was different in ways she had not anticipated. Not just practically different, though the practical differences were significant, having Jonas's labor and his knowledge and his resources combined with her own meant that she could do more, plan bigger, move faster on projects she had been slowly working toward for years. But it was different in a deeper way than that. It was different because the work had company, because the decisions had a second voice. Because in the evenings when she came in from the fields there was someone at the table, and the supper they ate together was a conversation rather than a quiet meal with her own thoughts. She moved into the ranch house. Her cabin became a bunkhouse for the extra seasonal labor they brought on that summer. Her cattle were combined with Jonas's. Her operation merged with his into a single larger enterprise under their joint management. She kept her own account book. He kept his. They compared them every Sunday evening over supper, which was a practice that had started practically and had become, unexpectedly, One of her favorite rituals of the week, two people who respected each other's intelligence going over numbers together, arguing occasionally about priorities, arriving at decisions through genuine negotiation rather than one person simply overriding the other. She had not known it was possible to be partners with someone in marriage the way she was partners with Jonas. She had not had a model for it. She had grown up watching her father run his household with benign authority, which was gentle but still unilateral. She had been married to Richard Colton, who had run his household with considerably less benign and much less gentle unilateral authority. She had arrived in Montana with a conviction, built from experience, that in a marriage one person's judgment always overrode the other's, and that the person whose judgment got overridden was going to be the woman. Jonas Turner had apparently not received that particular memo, or had received it and discarded it without much deliberation, and the result was a marriage that functioned with a practical equity that she had not known she was allowed to want, and that she appreciated more deeply with each passing month. He was not without friction, of course. He was not an easy man in all ways. He had opinions and he held them firmly, and when he thought she was wrong, he said so directly. He could be taciturn in a way that, early in their marriage, occasionally made her wonder if something was wrong before she learned to read the difference between his thinking quiet and his troubled quiet. He pushed himself very hard, and he pushed the operation very hard, and she had to argue with him twice that first season about taking on more than the operation could comfortably support at once, which she knew something about from her own first years of overreach. But the friction was the friction of two strong people building something together, not the friction of incompatibility or hidden motive or concealed betrayal. It was honest friction, and she had learned to tell the difference. In the summer of 1888, a problem arrived from the east in the form of a man named Harlan Stokes. Harlan Stokes was a land broker who had been moving through the territory representing a Chicago investment consortium that was buying up homestead land at below-market prices, then consolidating it and reselling it to large agricultural corporations that were beginning to move into the territory in significant numbers. He had already acquired 4 homesteads to the east of Dalton Creek, and he came to see both Susan and Jonas with what he described as a very favorable offer. He sat in their kitchen, and he was polished and articulate and pleasant, and he presented the offer in terms that sounded reasonable until you worked through the actual numbers, at which point the offer was approximately 40% below what the land was worth, which was a kind of financial trap that Susan recognized immediately because she had spent years watching Richard Colton operate in exactly the same way. She did not let him finish his presentation. "No," she said. Harlan Stokes looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has not been accustomed to the word coming from a woman this quickly. He looked at Jonas. Jonas looked back at him with an expression that was absolutely neutral and said, "You heard her." Stokes tried again, reframing the offer, and Susan said, without particular heat but with complete finality, "Mr. Stokes, I spent 3 years building this property and my husband spent 14 years building his. Your offer does not reflect either of those investments. We are not interested at any price close to what you are proposing." Stokes tried a third approach, suggesting that conditions in the territory were changing, and that holding onto land at this scale would become increasingly difficult for small operators, which was a specific kind of pressure designed to trigger fear. Susan had lived through enough fear to know when someone was manufacturing it for purposes of manipulation. "I think we are done here," she said, and stood up. Stokes left. He came back the following week with a slightly higher offer. She declined again. He sent a letter in September with a higher offer still, and she wrote a response declining in clear, precise language and sent it back with the return mail. She learned later that Stokes had had more success with 2 of her neighbors to the south, both of whom had sold under pressure, and had regretted it within a year when land values rose as the territory moved toward statehood. She felt the particular dark satisfaction of having read the situation correctly and having held her ground. Jonas, when she told him this, said, "I never doubted you for a moment." She looked at him. "You never told me that." "I knew you did not need me to," he said, "but I was thinking it." Montana achieved statehood in November of 1889, which brought a wave of change through the territory that affected everything from land law to tax structure to the political organization of the region. Susan and Jonas spent the winter of 1889 working through the implications for their operation, adjusting their records and plans accordingly, and attending 2 public meetings in Dalton Creek at which the new state's land and water rights were discussed. At the second of these meetings, Susan spoke. This was not something she had planned. A dispute had arisen about water rights along the creek system that ran through several properties in the area, and the men doing most of the talking were proposing an arrangement that would have significantly disadvantaged the smaller landholders in the area, several of whom were women running properties alone since their husbands had died. Susan Brenner Turner stood up in the Dalton Creek Community Hall in November of 1889 and laid out, in clear and meticulous terms, exactly why the proposed water rights arrangement was inequitable, what the legal basis for an alternative arrangement was, and what specific outcomes the community would see under each option. The room was very quiet when she sat down. The arrangement that was ultimately adopted was closer to the equitable version she had proposed than to the one the larger interests had wanted. She did not claim credit for this publicly, but Reverend Hale shook her hand on the way out and said, "That was well done, Mrs. Turner." Jonas was beside her, and she felt rather than saw the particular quality of his attention, the focused warmth of it. When they were outside in the cold night air walking to the wagon, he said, "Have I told you recently that I am extraordinarily lucky?" She laughed. "You have a habit of telling me things after the fact," she said. "I am working on that," he said, and she took his arm, and they rode home under the enormous Montana sky, which was full of stars the way it was full of stars in a way that never stopped feeling like an abundance. They had been talking about children. Not urgently, not with pressure. She was 31 and he was 35, and they both understood that they were not young, and that this would be what it would be, but talking, as people who are building a life together talk about the things they hope for. In the spring of 1890, Susan discovered that she was expecting. She told Jonas on a Sunday evening, after supper, with no particular ceremony because she had not yet learned how to handle very large feelings with anything other than directness. She said, "I am going to have a baby," and watched him go completely still in the same way he had gone still when she took his hand by the creek, that held quality of someone receiving something they had wanted for a long time. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her with the careful, complete attention that was his particular way of expressing things that were too large for words, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself feel the fullness of it. The pregnancy was not easy. She had a sustained, difficult period in the early months that left her, for the first time since arriving in Montana, unable to do the full physical work of the ranch. She hated it. She hated it with the particular intensity of a very capable person who has been reduced by circumstance, and Jonas navigated her frustration with a patience that she recognized as enormous, and which she appreciated even when she was being unreasonable about it. "You do not have to carry the whole operation," he said to her one afternoon in July when she was sitting on the porch watching him do work she had intended to do herself. "I know," she said. "But you want to," he said. "Obviously," she said. He stopped what he was doing and came and sat beside her on the porch steps and looked at her. "Susan," he said, "I want you to hear this and believe it. This," he gestured at the land, the ranch, all of it, "is not going to fall apart because you are not doing every piece of it right now. I have got it. The men have got it. Your job right now is the other thing." She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass below the porch, that bright, elaborate song that she had come to associate with summer mornings in Montana. The mountains on the horizon were dark blue and permanent, the way they always were. "I am not good at depending on people," she said. "I know," he said. "You are getting better at it." She looked at him. "Am I? You let me help with the fence posts," he said. She laughed, the laugh that surprised her, the one he had always been good at producing. "That was a strategic decision," she said. "Sure it was," he said with that almost smile, and she leaned her head against his shoulder on the porch steps in the July afternoon, and the meadowlark kept singing, and she let herself depend on him, which by now she had learned did not mean diminishment but simply the particular kind of trust that is the opposite of fear. Their son was born in November of 1890, during a fierce early winter storm that kept the midwife, Mrs. Calloway, from town, stranded with them for 3 days afterward. He was healthy and loud and had Jonas's dark hair and Susan's particular determined set to his expression, visible even in infancy. They named him Thomas for her father. Jonas held the baby with an expression that Susan stored in the permanent archive of the most important things she had ever seen, the complete dissolution of the controlled reserve that was his default, replaced by something unguarded and enormous, the face of a man encountering something that has permanently changed the scale of everything he understood himself to be. "Hello, Thomas," he said, in a voice she had never heard him use before, something very quiet and entirely without armor. "I am your father." She was watching this from the bed, more tired than she had ever been in her life and more awake to the present moment than she had ever been in her life simultaneously, and she thought, 3 years ago I was standing at a fence line alone, and now here is this. Here is all of this. Thomas was a good baby by the standards of babies in that era, which meant that the nights were still very hard but not catastrophically so. And Susan discovered that Jonas, who could function on limited sleep from years of cattle operation demanding it, was genuinely useful in the middle of the night hours in a way that she had not anticipated, and which touched her deeply every single time. She watched him walk the length of the ranch house kitchen at 2 in the morning with their son against his shoulder, this large, weathered, quiet man moving with the same steady patience with his child that he had brought to every other thing in his life, and she thought, I chose this man. I chose well. The years built. Each one brought something new, not always easy, not always without conflict, but always forward. In 1891, they expanded the cattle operation significantly, buying a section of land to the north that had come available when a neighbor sold to move closer to family. Susan took the lead on the negotiation because she was better at it than Jonas, who knew it and said so without any apparent difficulty, and she got the land at a price that satisfied both of them. In 1892, there was a drought that made the summer long and anxious, with every rancher in the area watching the sky and managing water carefully. They got through it better than most because Susan had been building the creek bank management system for 2 years specifically against the possibility of a dry year, and the habit of thinking ahead that she had developed from necessity in her first years alone served them both very well. In 1893, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, and Jonas went very quiet when they chose the name, a quiet that Susan understood meant something specific, and she took his hand and he held it for a long time and neither of them said anything, and the weight of the name between them was not sad but was respectful of the full complexity of the life that had led them here. Clara was everything Thomas was, not quiet where he was loud, watchful where he was immediate, content to sit and observe the world before engaging with it. By 3 years old, she already had the look of someone filing information away for later use, an expression that Jonas told Susan, with considerable amusement, was entirely familiar. "She looks like you when you are deciding something," he said. "She looks like you when you are watching something," Susan said. "Both of us then," he said. "Both of us," she agreed, and the simplicity of that satisfaction settled around them like the lamplight in the kitchen, warm and steady and entirely real. The summer of 1894 brought a visitor that Susan had not expected, and that forced open a chapter she thought she had entirely closed. Richard Colton arrived in Dalton Creek on a Tuesday morning in June. She was in town at the trading post when she saw him, and for one terrible second the old fear, the old humiliation, the old specific helplessness that he had made her feel moved through her like a cold current. But the second passed, and what replaced it was something much steadier and much harder, and she stood her ground in front of Gerald Marsh's trading post and watched Richard Colton walk toward her with the particular studied ease of a man who has rehearsed his approach. He had aged. He was 40 years old now, and the charm was still there, but it had taken on a slightly worn quality, like a coat that has been aired and repressed many times. He was dressed well. He had the look of someone who had found other sources of income after she had removed herself as one. "Susan," he said, "you are looking well." "Richard," she said, "what are you doing here?" He told her a story. She listened to the story with the specific attentiveness of someone who had learned the hard way to hear what was underneath the words. The story involved a business proposition, a mining concern in the territory, some document he needed her signature on related to a jointly held property from their marriage that she had not known about. She told him she had no jointly held property with him. She told him that every legal instrument related to their marriage had been resolved in 1884. She told him, very calmly and very clearly, that she was not going to sign anything and that she was going to consult her own legal counsel before she signed anything ever again under any circumstance. He tried 3 different approaches. She declined each of them. He left. She rode home and she told Jonas that evening, not from obligation but because she wanted to, because she had learned that telling Jonas difficult things made her feel less alone with them and not, as she had feared it would be, diminished or vulnerable. He listened to the whole account. When she finished, he looked at her and said, "Do you need anything from me on this?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "I handled it. I just wanted you to know." "Then I know," he said, "and he will not come back." He did not come back. She did not know whether that was because she had declined him thoroughly or because something else made him move on, but she was not inclined to spend time wondering. She spent her energy on things worth spending it on. In 1895, Pete, who had worked for Jonas for nearly a decade and had grown from a grinning young hand into a skilled and thoroughly reliable cattleman, met a woman named Anna who had come to Dalton Creek to teach at the new school. He was 28 and she was 25, and the courtship was swift and obvious and extremely poorly concealed, and Susan watched the whole thing develop with enormous satisfaction, because she recognized the particular quality of a man who had fallen completely helplessly in love, and who was still trying to maintain some dignity about it. She told Jonas about this observation, and he said, "I would not know anything about that," in the absolutely flat tone that meant he knew exactly what she was referring to and was choosing to handle it with dignity. "You were terrible at concealing it," she told him. "I was concealing nothing," he said. "I was simply present in proximity to the fence line." She laughed and he let himself laugh too, and Thomas, who was 5, looked up from the floor where he was playing with a set of carved wooden cattle that Jonas had made him over the winter, apparently decided that his parents' laughing meant something good was happening, and grinned enormously. Pete married Anna that autumn. Susan and Jonas gave them a piece of land at the eastern edge of the Turner property, the section that Jonas had always said was too far from the main operation to manage efficiently, and that was exactly the right size for a young couple starting out. It was Jonas's idea. He mentioned it one evening and watched Susan carefully after because he knew it was his land to give, but he also knew that decisions of that scale were ones they made together. She said, "That is the right thing to do." He nodded. "I thought so." "Have I told you recently," she said, and she was echoing him from years back and they both knew it, "that I am extraordinarily lucky?" He smiled. The full one, the rare one, the one she had spent years accumulating occasions for. "Once or twice," he said. Their second son arrived in 1896. They named him James, which was Jonas's father's name, and Susan had noticed the particular careful quality with which Jonas had accepted this suggestion the first time she raised it. The way he had looked at her as though checking whether she understood what she was suggesting. She understood. She had watched him carry the complex weight of his relationship with his father for years, the mixture of anger and grief, an incomplete understanding that a man carries about a father who was not there in the ways that mattered. She thought naming this child James was a way of making something neutral from something that had carried charge, a way of saying, "The name belongs to your son now, not only to your pain." He had not used that many words. He had simply said yes. James was, from approximately the first 6 weeks of his life, an extremely cheerful person with no apparent capacity for any sustained negative feeling, a personality that seemed to have arrived entirely formed, and that bore no resemblance to either of his parents' more complex emotional architectures. Thomas adored him. Clara studied him with her usual observational intensity, and occasionally made him a gift of her complete and specific attention, which he received with uncomplicated delight. The family settled into the rhythms that families make over years, the accumulation of seasons and rituals and shared references that build the particular interior language of a household. Susan became, without intending it, something of an authority in the Dalton Creek community on matters of land management and water rights, and she served on 2 committees over the next several years that dealt with regional planning questions. Jonas, who had always been respected in the area for the scale of what he had built, was respected additionally now for the quality of what he had built, for the fact that the Turner operation was not simply large, but was run with integrity and with attention to the land itself. He turned down an offer in 1897 to sell a large section to a mining company, on the grounds that the mining activity would damage the creek system and affect water quality for everyone in the area. He made this decision without consulting Susan in advance, which was the one significant argument they had that year. "That was a decision that affected both of us," she said, with the focused calm she used when she was genuinely angry. "You should have talked to me before you refused." He took this without deflection. "You are right," he said. "I did not think of it that way in the moment. I should have." "You absolutely should have," she said. "I know," he said. "I am sorry, Susan." She looked at him for a moment. "For the record," she said, "I would have refused them too." "I know," he said. "But you should have been part of refusing them." "Yes," she said, "I should have." They did not fight often, and when they did it was this kind of fight, real, direct, resolved through actual accountability rather than performance. She valued this. She knew what the other kind looked like. The century turned. January of 1900 found them on the porch of the ranch house in the cold, clear Montana morning, looking out over land that was frozen and beautiful and entirely theirs, with their 3 children inside the warm house making noise in various registers of chaos. Jonas had coffee, she had coffee. The mountains on the horizon were white with winter snow that would not leave until April. 20 years ago, she said, you were in Texas. Driving cattle north, he said. I was in Cincinnati, she said, learning to keep accounts for a man who did not deserve the help. And now, he said. And now, she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the familiar warmth of him, this man she had known for 15 years and married for 12 and built a life within the fullest possible meaning of that phrase. I am glad I was watching, he said. She turned her head and looked at him, at the face she knew so well, the lines that the sun and the wind and the years had put there, the dark eyes that still saw too much and that she had long since stopped trying to hide from, the corner of his mouth that moved before he smiled. I am glad you stopped watching, she said. He smiled, the full one. I am done watching, he said. I told you that. She laughed and he held her closer against the cold of the Montana morning, and the children's voices carried through the door behind them, and the mountains stood white and permanent on the horizon, and the land stretched away in every direction, beautiful and real and theirs. There were more years after that one. That is the nature of a good life, When you have been lucky enough to build one, it keeps going. It keeps adding, it keeps becoming. Thomas grew into a tall, direct young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and took on management of a significant portion of the ranch operation at 17, with a competence that was not surprising to anyone who had watched him grow up in the particular household that he had grown up in. He had his mother's gift for negotiation and his father's gift for reading land and animals, and the combination made him formidable in the best possible way. Clara, who had been watching and filing everything away since infancy, turned those capacities toward a deep interest in botany, and in the particular ecology of the grassland and creek systems that she had grown up around. She read voraciously, corresponded with researchers at universities in the East, and was, by the time she was 18, producing written observations about the local ecosystem that were technically sophisticated and practically useful. Susan watched this with pride that was partly personal and partly something larger, the pride of watching a woman use her intelligence without apology in a world that was slowly learning to make more room for that. James remained cheerful. James was going to remain cheerful apparently no matter what happened, which Susan and Jonas had accepted as one of the great gifts of their particular family, because in a household full of people who took everything seriously, James's constitutional sunniness was a regular source of actual relief. In 1903, Thomas married a rancher's daughter from the north end of the county, a young woman named Helen who could ride and rope and read contracts, and who looked at Thomas with a clear-eyed assessment that Susan recognized and approved of completely. Jonas walked through the morning of the wedding with the particular contained expression of a man who is experiencing something very large and is managing it with great discipline, and Susan held his hand through the ceremony and felt, beside the happiness, the particular bittersweet quality of time, the way the years between that fence line in September 1887 and this moment in the church in 1903 collapsed into something that felt like both an instant and a lifetime simultaneously. He caught her looking at him during the reception and said, "What are you thinking?" "About fence posts," she said. He stared at her for a moment and then laughed, the full, unguarded laugh, and she laughed with him. And Helen looked at her new parents-in-law and asked Thomas quietly what was funny, and Thomas said he genuinely had no idea but that it clearly had something to do with the property line, and left it at that. The ranch in 1905 was a different thing from the combined properties they had merged in 1888, grown through careful management and thoughtful acquisition into one of the most well-regarded cattle operations in that part of Montana. They employed 12 permanent hands and ran seasonal crews for roundup and branding. The ranch house had been expanded twice, and the original cabin where Susan had lived alone for her first years on the property had become a proper bunkhouse that she occasionally still walked past and felt the particular complicated pride of remembering who she had been when she lived in it. Susan was 50 years old in 1909, which seemed impossible and which she declined to make a great occasion of, but Jonas made the occasion anyway, quietly, in the way he made most things. He arranged for Thomas and Helen, Clara and James to all be home for a Sunday supper, which required some logistics given that they had scattered somewhat in their respective lives, and he had gotten hold of a bottle of the best whiskey available in Dalton Creek, which was considerably better than what had been available in 1888, and he had, apparently, taught himself to bake a cake at some point without ever mentioning this capability to anyone. She sat at the table of her ranch house kitchen with her 3 children and her son's wife and her husband, and she ate cake that Jonas Turner had baked and which was not perfect but was genuine, and she thought about all of it: the Cincinnati courtroom, the stagecoach, the cabin, the fence line, the hammer in her hand, the words that had shifted the tectonic plates. "I have watched you work alone every season," he had said, "and I am done watching. 22 years. She looked down the table at him, this man who was 60 now and wore the years in the way that outdoor men wear them, deeply and honestly, and he was looking at her across the table with those dark reading eyes that had always seen too much and that she was grateful for every single day. She raised her glass. "To the fence line," she said. The children exchanged looks of tolerant confusion. Jonas raised his glass, and the smile was the full one that she had spent years accumulating occasions for. "To the fence line," he said. They had a long time left together after that evening. They had the full, continued depth of a life built by two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost, and who had gone on choosing each other every day in the smaller, quieter ways that are the actual substance of a shared life. The morning coffee, the Sunday accounts, the arguments that ended in genuine resolution, the evenings on the porch watching the light change over the mountains that they had watched together for so long that the mountains had become part of the architecture of them. Susan Brenner Turner outlived every expectation that she had had for herself in that Cincinnati courtroom, and every expectation she had had in that first terrible, lonely winter when she had run short of hay and caught the fever and lost the cattle through the fence. She outlived the fears that Richard Colton had put in her. She outlived the brittleness of the armor she had worn at 26, which had been replaced by something much stronger and much less rigid. The particular kind of strength that grows not from protecting yourself from everything, but from knowing that you have already survived the worst and chosen well despite it. She stood at the western fence line once more in the autumn of 1912, in the warm September light that was the same September light as the one she had stood in 25 years before, and she looked out over land that was hers in every sense of that word, worked and known and loved, and she heard hoofbeats. Jonas dismounted on his side of the fence and walked over, the same fence line, the same grass, the same mountains on the horizon, and he was 63, and she was 53, and his hair was white at the temples, and they had built everything they had between them from the ground up, and it was all still here. He stood at the fence and looked at her, and she looked at him. "You are watching again," she said. "I am always watching," he said. "You said you were done watching," she said. "I said I was done watching you work alone," he said. "You are not working alone anymore." She looked at him across the fence line that had been the boundary between two separate lives and that had become, over the years, simply the western edge of what they had together. And she felt, as she had felt on the porch in 1900 and in the kitchen in 1888 and by the creek in 1886 and on the fence rail in the corral, the same thing. The particular, permanent rightness of this man, of this choice, of this life. She opened the gate. She had put the gate in herself, the summer of 1888, right here at this spot on the fence line. The first summer they were married, because a fence line between people who are building something together is a thing that needs a gate, and she had been the one to put it in because that was the kind of thing she did and always had and always would. Jonas Turner walked through the gate and came to stand beside her, and they stood together in the September afternoon, with the grass moving in the wind around them and the mountains holding still and permanent in the blue distance, and she took his hand the way she had taken it by the creek in December of 1887, in the cold and the ice and the beginning of everything. The land was beautiful. The land was theirs. The life they had built on it was the most real thing either of them had ever touched. Susan Brenner Turner looked at the man beside her, the weathered cattleman who had watched her, and stopped watching, and crossed the fence line, and stayed, and she thought, this is what it is to have chosen correctly. Not once in a single dramatic moment, but over and over, in all the small and ordinary moments that stack up into years, into a life, into the particular kind of love that is not a feeling but a fact, solid as the fence posts they had repaired together in the autumn of 1887, permanent as the mountains, as enduring as the land beneath their feet that they had made into home.